Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you for joining us again in another episode of Through My Eyes with Professor Bolaji Akinyemi. And in this special edition, which we have called the Diplomacy Masterclass Edition. But before we go into the show this evening, Prof, I know there is something you want to share with our viewers.
Well, yes. Good evening. I will skip the usual greetings because yesterday, Wednesday, August the 5th, a major tragedy, a major calamity took place in Lebanon, which should be a lesson to all of us. And one should not allow that event to pass by without stressing it so it could register in the brains and in the consciousness of all of us. I am referring to the major explosion that has claimed the lives now of over 1,000 people, that has destroyed probably the central part of Beirut. Injuries have run into thousands, all because of sheer carelessness of politicians and carelessness of civil servants. Those people who are in the business of ruling us and keeping us safe from danger. Lebanon is a model for developing countries. Now, I'm not saying this cannot happen in an upper economy country, but it's more likely to happen in a developing country where minor issues are ignored because there's no money to be gained from dealing with it. Evidence that we have now made it clear that there were professionals at the port who kept bringing the issue to the attention of ministers, the National Assembly, the executive, that this nitrate, which everybody knew was capable of exploding at any time, had been warehoused at the Lebanese port for the past 6 years, and nobody dealt with it. Nobody paid any attention. Now, in how many of our countries do you have abandoned containers, whether at the port or at the airport or in dry ports, where they pose danger of enormous proportion to the citizen, and yet nobody is paying any attention to it because it does not involve big companies. The money that collected is so minor that nobody wants to waste his time dealing with it. Where we see what in Lebanon, it can happen in any of our countries if we don't pay any attention. Governance is not about just the big contracts. It's not just about the big issues. Governance is also paying a matter. Thank you.
All right. Thank you, Prof, for that very point regarding what is happening in Lebanon. And some of those pictures were really painful to watch, of families that have now been devastated. And as you say, people knew about this and they did nothing about it. All right. Thank you once again to all our viewers. I can see people coming in on YouTube, on Facebook. First of all, today is a special one in this series, and it's what we've called the Diplomacy Masterclass. And this is where the professor is going to be talking about different areas, different things that has contributed to him being the success that he is today in when it comes to foreign policy, when it comes to governance. I think it's clear, and even we saw in the press this week, that the Prof is one of the most highly regarded people in the world when it comes to foreign policy, diplomacy, and this point. So it's such an honor to be interviewing the professor on this really important area. But Prof, before we go into the diplomacy masterclass points, last week we talked about this issue of loans being taken by African countries. And you took time to explain to us how those loans are usually structured. But a lot of people still don't understand the process. A lot of people are still complaining about this. They're highlighting the issue in Zambia. They're highlighting the fact that African nations have this propensity to take loans and then ask for debt forgiveness. Can you explain this again to our viewers? What it really means and what takes place in this type of conversations?
Let me make one thing absolutely clear. I agree with people who are uneasy about the whole of the debt issue in as far as it relates to Africa, whether by the Chinese, by the Americans, by the Western countries, or any other person or any other institution. Don't forget that we went through a period where airplanes and shipping lines of African countries were being impounded all over the world because they didn't pay their landing charges, they didn't pay for, haven't been fueled. There were charges that were outstanding, and companies did not hesitate to seize them because that was the agreement that they had. And this had nothing to do with the Chinese. This was being done by Western companies and by Western countries. So I wanted to make that point clear to start with. Number two, I agree with people who said they are uneasy because African nations or developing nations, because Sri Lanka is one of them, go in for loans which they know they cannot repay. It's not a question of not being able to repay because circumstances have changed. They knew ab initio from the beginning that there's no way they can repay this loan. And you are quite right that people should be upset that knowing fully well that you cannot repay, you then take the loan and start asking for debt reschedulement. People who grant you those loans also must know that they will be able to get their money back one way or the other. If they grant you debt forgiveness or debt reschedulement, it's probably because they are going to ask you when you are negotiating at an international conference for your vote. Or maybe at the United Nations, one of their candidates is running for office and they'll ask you for your vote. They'll remind you how they were kind to you, or how, we are negotiating over that loan repayment. Well, it will be a good idea if you vote for us, and then we can inform our government that we've been a friendly country. So, but there's no way they will reschedule your loan or grant you loan forgiveness for nothing. The point we should get clear in our mind is that there is a difference between sovereign immunity, which lawyers will probably call jure imperi, and economic immunity, which lawyers will call jure gestionis. From around 1918, and keep that date in mind, that was the time that followed the revolution in the then Soviet Union, and the state became a major driver, if in fact a major owner, let's call it that way, of companies which before were being run by the private sector. The state itself became the owners, and the state itself, Russia, became economic drivers, economic agents, economic owners, but doing business. That was when the issue then arose in a way that caught the attention of the world, because Russia was claiming sovereign immunity for the companies that it owned, that it owned, and that was taking part in international trade, in business. It was claiming diplomatic immunity. And that's when international law then started making a distinction between institutions that has to do with diplomacy per se, and institutions that have to do with economic relations. And that's why they then started making that distinction, that sovereign immunity, simpliciter, can only apply to political relations that are related to your diplomacy. But that when it comes to economic relations, trading, buying and selling, contracts, etc., you cannot claim sovereign immunity for them, or else you will be putting your partner at a disadvantage. So that is the point that people, now Africans or developing countries, should keep in their mind, that you cannot claim immunity for economic relations. In the realm of economic relations, you cannot claim immunity, even though your state, as a state, is a party to that contract. That's what you should keep in mind. And that is what all this debate is all about. But people keep, I think it's a pity that in this particular contract we are talking about, the term sovereign immunity was used. If I were the minister in charge of that project, I wouldn't use that term. I would simply say you cannot claim immunity when it comes to repayment of your loan, you cannot claim immunity when there are disagreements. I wouldn't use the term sovereign, but it has been used. If I were in the National Assembly, I would simply say we are going to delete this. But it is interesting that the Chinese Foreign Ministry had issued a statement that Nigerian sovereignty was not at stake in this matter. I'm not really familiar with the terms of their contract with some of the other African countries. I don't know what is in those contracts, but there is no international law. And this is the last point I wish to make and be categorical about it. There is no international law that will permit China to march into any African country and seize any of the government institutions or government buildings. No international law will permit that. But if it is in the contract, which with their eyes open they signed, then that's a totally different matter.
Wow. Wow. Hopefully that would have dealt with that point for our viewers. And as we go along, I just want to remind our viewers that please, if you've got your questions, put them in on YouTube, put them in on Facebook, and we will do our best. Again, you can put them in on Slido. If you are on Slido, you can put that there. The number to use is 42247. 42247. If you're on Slido, you can ask your questions on that point as well. And also, you can do this on Twitter. Go to the Twitter account, my Twitter account, at Akin Akinyemi on Twitter, and you can ask your questions there, and we'll put all those questions to the Prof. So, sir, there is an interesting question here as we go into this diplomatic masterclass, where someone has asked this question. It says that Professor Bolaji Akinyemi is a very learned and respected man when it comes to foreign policy and governance. However, it is clear that the professor in his early years could also be considered a gifted child. Can he please tell us the two most important things that have helped him to keep his focus? And secondly, what advice do you have for other people who may be considered as talented and maybe have not had the same opportunities as you?
Well, thank you, by the way, for those positive comments. I do appreciate them. My own take on this issue is that there are four factors that are responsible for a man's or a woman's success in the world. One has been identified by your questionnaire: talent or ability, whatever you will call it. Number two, opportunity. Number three, hard work. Then number four, God's grace.
Wow.
Now, I'm not a preacher, so I'm not about to start quoting the Bible. I first came across Chancellor Adenauer, the first post-war chancellor of Western Germany, usage of this concept. He was asked, what is responsible for your success? And he answered that you are standing on a stage thinking of what to do, and there walks by God and you just hold on to the tail end of the garment of God, and that's what is responsible for success. And what he was saying was, you could have the talent, you could have the opportunity, you could work hard, you be in the office all throughout the day and late into the night. But unless what you will call good luck, and I'm not referring to the former Nigerian president, good luck is what I mean as a concept, but I will call it God's grace, unless that intervenes. This is what makes the difference between somebody else who also has talent, who also has opportunity, who also had hard work, and yet he doesn't make it. It's because the last one that is missing. Or if you really want me to then be biblical about it, the Bible
Why not,
says,
Prof?
the Bible says, unless God builds the city, the workmen worketh, but in vain. So we all need this divine umbrella, this divine intervention in our life. And who are we to query God if that divine intervention is not there? We were not consulted when he was giving us talents, opportunities, because he's still the one who brings the opportunities our way. So who are we then to query him? That very final factor. So really I'm saying my success, which is what you call it, and I'm grateful that I got that recognition from your questioner, is not due to my ability alone. I give the recognition to God. And I think that if once you keep that in mind, then you will not be disappointed, because you won't know when he will intervene. So you will just continue to work hard. You will just continue to do your best to the best of your ability. Don't give up, because your time is not his time. Your questioner said, I must have, had this talent from when, I was, but if I give you my examples of how many times I was beaten in primary school, in secondary school, you wouldn't be talking about talent from an early age.
When you were beaten by who, Prof?
Well, started with my mom, who was a strict disciplinarian, and then the teachers in primary school and the teachers in secondary school. I know these days it is regarded as not being done to talk about being beaten. But in my time, part of the discipline was to have it beaten into you. And just to make sure that you don't go away. This concept of preaching to a young child is a Western concept that I don't buy into. But let's not go into that. Just talking about my own, the discipline was, beaten into me. And it had worked for me. So I keep saying that it has worked for me, may not work for somebody else. But there are, look, let me quickly illustrate what I will call my first break after I got my doctorate degree. My first break. 1970, I returned to Nigeria and became a university lecturer. And given my discipline, international affairs, I discovered that there was a vacuum. There was no platform for what I would regard as the foreign policy elite to meet and exchange views, have a dialogue, have a conversation about Nigerian national interests, Pan-Africanism, African interest, how we could dovetail into the world interest. And I decided that what is missing is a Nigerian society of international affairs. And I then decided, fine, we will establish one, but whom will we invite to be foundation members of this society? And I started, reading newspapers, who was saying what, at what time, and what have you. And among those that I invited were two people who later on became critical in my life. He was a brigadier at that time, Brigadier Murtala Mohammed and Brigadier Olusegun Obasanjo. Now, I didn't know they were planning a coup, or that they will be planning a coup 3 years after we formed the society. But they did. One became head of state. One became his number 2 in command. And they decided that they wanted an expert in foreign affairs to come and help them out. Now, it's possible that there were more brilliant people than I in that field, but I was the only one they had interacted with. And that became easier for them to say, come in and help us. And that is what I will call the grace of God. That's
Amazing.
What I will call the grace of God. Because supposing I didn't establish the Nigerian Society of International Affairs, or when I established it, I didn't invite these people. I could say, no, I don't want military people there. I just want people who were teaching in the university. I didn't make that decision. The decision I made was to make it an inclusive one and see how it benefited me. That is an illustration of what I will call the grace of God.
Wow. But again, for the individual, because this is a masterclass here, the individual who is saying, what can I pick out of this? From what you said there, Prof, you had an idea, you saw a gap, you didn't know what was going to happen, you took action, and suddenly something happened. I'm sure people will call that the work of faith.
All right.
Wow.
Whatever you call it, faith, luck, I've used my own terminology.
As grace. Fantastic. Wow. All right. While still on this point, before we move on, in the context of an organization, how would these sort of principles you've talked about in your story here, how will that play out in the context of a business owner, for example?
Well, be clear in your mind, your objective. 2, be prepared to accept bright minds surrounding you. Be prepared to share that focus with them. And if they bind to that focus, adopt a teamwork approach with them. Number 4, if there are disruptive elements, don't waste your time trying to persuade them. Let them go. And if they won't go, kick them out. So you can focus all your energy on those who share your dreams and your vision for the organization. Don't be afraid to assert your authority. You are the CEO or you are the owner of the company. Don't be afraid to assert your authority. And you'll recall that whether it's last week or week before, when we were talking about the institution of whistleblower because this is what
Yes.
applies now to in these institutions. I was now suggesting that whistleblowers who deliberately come up with false allegations are disruptive elements. And once an independent agency had come to the conclusion that these whistleblowers are just being negative, they are being, that the allegations that they have made have no foundation, they should be asked to go, to leave the organization. But if the CEO has been found guilty of the allegations that are being made, then the CEO should be asked to leave the organization. Of course, if you own the organization, well, you can't be asked to go. On the other hand, you will have to reform your methods if the allegations are found to be true. So, but within the private sector, don't waste your time trying to reform disruptive elements. Let them go. Let them go and form their own companies. In your company, focus on the people who share your vision. And as I said, don't be afraid to surround yourself with bright brains. They are no threat to you if you yourself, you are focused in your mind about what you want the company to achieve. Bright brains are of no threat to you. In fact, what is of threat to you are wishy-washy people who just want to play along, swim along in the company and add no value to what you are trying to do. Those are the ones that are not going to help you achieve your objective.
Wow. Very important lessons there, sir. Thank you for that. Now, there's a question here where someone had says, do you consider rising tensions among nations, China and the many countries, Israel neighbors, Turkey neighbors? Do you consider this a failure of democracy? And what are the most significant factors that undermine such diplomatic dialogue?
Although I heard what you said, does the questioner mean a failure of diplomacy rather than a failure of democracy?
A failure of diplomacy.
Aha. No, I don't regard this conflict as a failure of diplomacy. In a global sense, I don't, because the essence of diplomacy is to ensure that interests are well articulated, that neither party is under an illusion about the interests of the sides that are around the table. What will be the failure of diplomacy is if the conflicts then arise out of a misunderstanding, out of a misconception. That would when we could talk about a failure of diplomacy. But it's possible that there are conflicts that cannot be resolved through conversation, through negotiation, and those are the classical terms in diplomacy. That is then when the issue of threats come in. Where then, and I can give an illustration. When Saddam Hussein, the former president of Iraq,
Yes.
Went to war and occupied one of the Arab countries.
Yeah.
After the war, he was then asked a question. You went to do, that's after the first Iraq war. He was then asked this question. I mean, what did you think you were doing that, you went to invade this other country? Didn't you think of what would be the reaction by the United States? And I will never forget his answer. He said, I am not crazy. If I had not got the wink and the nod by the American ambassador, I would never have invaded.
Wow.
He said he cleared it with the American ambassador. And it was like, well, they don't really feel that strongly about it. That is a failure of diplomacy, because he was given the wrong impression of what the reaction of the United States will be. That I would regard as a failure of diplomacy. However, if it was after he was told, we will fight you, that he still went for the invasion, you cannot regard that as an act of failure of diplomacy. As he himself said, it was an act of madness on his part. Now, so all these conflicts that you are talking about, probably we are running a danger where somebody is going to misinterpret someone.
Yes.
Part of something I read this past week actually made reference to this issue, that the reason we are at a dangerous point in global affairs is because somebody may make a mistake of maybe misunderstanding the resolution of the other party at a conflict. And in this article, reference was made to the First World War, which started off, well, I won't say innocently, but started off after the assassination of the Archduke Ferdinand in Yugoslavia. Yugoslavia or Serbia was not even at the center of the world at that time. So nobody would have thought something that happened in that little corner would have led to the First World War. But once it happened, nations started jumping in, issuing threats, issuing ultimatum, and before you had it, you had the First World War on your hand. And so the fear, which I share, is that with planes and naval ships flying all over the place, and collisions being imminent, and pilots are now having to avoid each other on the Southeast Asian Sea, somebody may just miscalculate. And there may be a collision of an American Air Force plane and a Chinese Air Force plane, or a collision between an American naval ship and a Chinese naval ship, or what is even more dangerous, it could be a collision between a Chinese ship and a ship not belonging to the United States, but belonging to one of American allies. It could be Japan. It could be Australia. And all of a sudden, the United States then feels it must come to the defense of its ally. So, and this is how things get, the things get out of hand. But Basically, in conclusion, to wrap up, I won't regard it as a failure of diplomacy. Some conflicts then just cannot be resolved by diplomacy. You have to resort to other means.
So that means fantastic. There's another question for you here, sir. And this is regarding the issue around the rise of technology companies and the impact they are having on information. And it says in this age of social media and digital transformation, where Google it seems to be the response to things we are ignorant of, how do you see the censoring of information by tech giants impacting diplomatic efforts? And the reason for that question is this, from this person here, is that social media puts a lot of issues in public domain well ahead of any tactful discourse.
Well, the first illustration of the danger posed to diplomacy was the activities of Wikileaks. Because diplomacy runs on the basis of secrecy. A diplomat must feel that that the discussion could be on the basis of confidentiality. For the very simple reason that in confidential conversations, a diplomat may have to make concessions. And yet, I mean, of course, this is with the approval of his government, but this cannot be done in the marketplace of public opinion, or else there will be an uproar. In fact, what governments fear most is the kind of pressure that comes from the public over issues they know very little about in dealing with other countries. Let me give you an illustration. During the Cuban Missile Crisis, Kennedy told Khrushchev, who was the prime minister of the Soviet Union at that time, he told him, if you pull those missiles out of Cuba, in 6 months' time, I will pull American missiles out of Turkey. Because the Soviet Union felt Turkey was right on its border, and here were American missiles, which were a threat, or they perceived it to be a threat to the Soviet Union. Kennedy made that offer to him. But he added, if this becomes public, the offer is off. And you will still have to withdraw those missiles from Cuba, or else we will have a third world war on our hands. So with that kind of understanding between the two leaders, without losing face, Russia or the Soviet Union pulled its missiles out of Cuba, and 6 months later, based on what you call strategic analysis, those missiles are no longer needed. Kennedy pulled the missiles out of Turkey. and the American public or the Russian public were not aware that they were acting out a deal. Well, in these days, when cables are no longer confidential and secret, when conversations are subject to leakage, it makes diplomacy slightly less productive and more difficult, because it then becomes, if you like, face-to-face negotiation, which you hope will then not leak. And we talked about this, I think about 2 months ago, when we were talking about memoirs being published
Yes.
by advisors.
Yes.
The danger again that poses. And it then led to a lot of countries saying, no, 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 Biden did not remember how this conversation went. It didn't go that way, because they had become embarrassed by some of the details that were leaked out in that book. So I regard the activities of the giants. In fact, it is not to diplomacy as such that I regard their activities as being dangerous. It is actually to the volume of information that they have on individuals. And we tend to think of them as technology, machines going into the memory, but it is still individuals who moderate these machines. The individuals who work for those companies have access to this data. So in a way, while we are worrying about the activities of the Secret Service, intelligence agencies, and so on, we should be worried about the activities and the danger to us of these technological giants. Because who controls them? When you're talking about intelligence agencies, they are controlled by Congress. They are controlled by Parliament. Parliament can make laws, and Parliament can have the oversight, supervision. But who controls these super giants? They are owners. One person controls the activities and the information and what have you of any of these super giants. That to me is what the threat to human civilization, not just you and I, because you and I are part of the human civilization. When you put all of us together, Americans, Russians, British, Nigerians, Indians, Pakistanis, Chinese, we form human civilization. Who now controls us? Who has access to our private info, our private data? These super giants. And I think that sooner or later, there probably is going to have to be an international convention that will control their activities. They are forming monopolies. Those monopolies need to be broken up such that one technological giant does not have all the data on human civilization that it can then manipulate if it wants to. It's not right. It isn't.
Well, someone is, there are two comments here on YouTube that I'm going to merge together. And this relates to the way the President Trump has been using social media as a means of releasing very sensitive information. And one is, how dangerous is this? And is this setting a precedent that other nations and other leaders could now start to follow, where social media is where people hear about very important things first?
The concern is quite legitimate. governance is not run that way. Just like I have said, there's confidentiality, there is secrecy. Your ambassador at post should know about the policy first through cables, through secure telephone conversations, rather than through Twitter. Twitter has never been and will never be the legitimate avenue for diplomacy. It can't be. Number two, we also should be worried about the use of social media to disseminate dangerous medical information. Dangerous medical information in terms of information that is not verified by the medical community. And this is why people are always saying, if you are ill, go and talk to your doctor. That's why he's trained. He knows better than you about even yourself. Not to now talk about a politician advising the whole world or his own citizens. And in fact, when he is the president of the United States, is the whole world is addressing about what to take for a headache, or what to take for an ulcer, or what to take for high blood pressure, is dangerous because it doesn't even tell you the quantity to take. Medicine should not be dictated by politics. It should be left to the medical people, just as there is a vast area that should be left to scientists rather than to politicians. It's unfortunate that the issue of the mask has become a political issue. That's dangerous. And the other day I was now watching a couple who said they themselves didn't believe in masks until they caught the COVID-19 virus, and that they almost got killed. And when they were being interviewed on air, they were wearing masks, even though they still said in their community it's not regarded as manly to wear masks, that they don't want to get killed. Now, must you wait until you endanger your life and the lives of other people because you are listening to politicians talking about what a medical issue should be, turning it to a political issue? So there's a whole range of issues that we need to be careful about. And I am happy, although it's just the beginning, that Twitter and Facebook are starting to take down accounts where they feel are violating the values they have set up or the threshold of danger which they have established. There's going to, after this COVID-19 or after the November election, there's going to be a lot for international institutions to handle. And this is where I hope that the United Nations will become energized to address these issues, or to set up specialized institutions that will address these issues. They are not hostile. It's not a question of being hostile towards human progress. It's just to ensure that human progress is really progress rather than danger to human civilization.
Prof, just before we go, there's a question here that I want to put to you. Again, we're not going to be able to go through all these points. Maybe we need to extend this thing another 5 or 10 minutes, I don't know. But it's this issue of calling for, in this era of COVID-19, you've talked about healthcare, but it's this issue of how do you handle local economies during this process? Some people, including yourself, has called for the development of local economies. But again, it's one of those areas where people have been raising different opinions. Where do you stand on the growth of local economies as a response to COVID-19?
Obviously, I am in favor of the growth of local economies, especially in, I always use this term, but maybe I will change it now to medium income countries. So I don't wave this, terminology of power and upset anybody. Medium income countries. I was very happy when I read just 2 days ago, Nigerian Air Force planes were now distributing PPE equipment manufactured in Nigeria to West African countries. Now, incidentally, I'm rather upset that it didn't make CNN or BBC, and yet they have correspondents here. But these things were manufactured here by Nigeria, but it was local production, and yet they had such quantities that they could not distribute free of charge. They were setting a value that when it comes to virus or medical emergencies, share with your neighbors. They were not charging them for this. And there are other areas, whether it is paracetamol or hydrochloroquine, which can be manufactured on the local level. What will be wrong and injurious to human health is where you have the high-income countries manufacturing vaccines and then keeping these vaccines for their own use, or charging medium income or low income countries vast amounts of money before these vaccines can be made available to them. So there has to be a balance. Not every country can produce motor vehicles. Not every country can produce airplanes. Not every country can build ships. Your economic and industrial capability will have to be a function of your GDP, your gross domestic product. But where it is of advantage to you to do it. Don't emphasize what I call, don't become dependent on importation as a way of satisfying your needs.
There's a question here, Prof. And I think we should respond to this before we go today. And this is a question from YouTube that says, must confidentiality be maintained at the expense of transparency in governance?
Yes. I mean, as a former practitioner myself, in fact, people had said, no, you're okay. There are two schools of thought. One school of thought says that the Crimean War, the Napoleonic Wars, and the First World War all came about because of confidentiality or secrecy of agreements and negotiations that are being reached. While the other school of thought said No. In fact, it is better to let some air into diplomacy, not to open the windows and allow gale force winds to come into diplomacy, but allow some air sufficiently that your people can know what kinds of interests that you are advancing, and that the more transparency there are, the more questions of ego will not determine whether a country goes to war or not. So those are the two schools of thought. And there's no doubt that there's something to be said for either. And you find your way into the middle range. But diplomacy cannot function on the pages of newspaper or CNN or BBC or Wikileaks. It cannot. It just cannot.
All right. We're going to have to stop here because of the time. But the good news is this. Diplomacy Masterclass continues for another 3 weeks. We're going to hear more stories from the Prof. We're going to hear real-life examples, practical examples for someone who has been in the field. He's done this, he's been there, he's got the experience to speak authoritatively. Join us again next week. There's so many questions here on YouTube and on Facebook that we've not been able to get to. Some of these, I think Prof has answered them already from what I can see here. But thank you everyone who has joined today. Please, please, please share these around with your friends. Let them know about this Diplomacy Masterclass. There is wisdom coming out here that people need to hear. Thank you very much for your time tonight, and we hope you will join us again next week.